For over a century, this photograph sat in an archive at the University of Alabama, cataloged simply as Three Sisters, Montgomery County, circa 1898. Historians had glanced at it, preserved it, digitized it. No one paid it much attention. It seemed unremarkable, just another portrait of another family trying to survive the brutal realities of the Jim Crow South. Nothing about it suggested mystery, nothing hinted at impossibility. Until Dr. Patricia Hayes zoomed in. Dr. Hayes, a medical historian at Vanderbilt University, had spent 3 years digitizing photographs of black families from the post-Reconstruction era. She'd processed thousands of images, cataloging faces, clothing, locations. Most of the work was routine, repetitive. Then one afternoon in March 2023, she opened the file containing the Three Sisters. She began her usual examination, checking image quality, adjusting the resolution. And then she saw something in the youngest sister's arms that made her breath catch. The musculature was wrong. Not just strong, but impossibly dense for a 16-year-old girl living in poverty in 1898. The definition visible even through the fabric of her dress belonged on a laborer twice her age. Dr. Hayes leaned closer to her screen, her heart racing. She'd seen something like this before, but only in modern medical journals documenting one of the rarest genetic conditions known to science, a condition that wouldn't be identified for another 99 years. If you're fascinated by hidden mysteries and old photographs, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. What we're about to uncover will change how you see history forever. The photograph was cataloged as item 4127 in the University of Alabama's Reconstruction-era archive. When Dr. Hayes first opened the digital file, she followed her standard protocol, checking the metadata, confirming the date and location, examining the image for any damage or degradation that might affect preservation. Montgomery County, Alabama, 1898. 3 subjects, female, estimated ages 16 to 18. Rural setting, likely sharecroppers or domestic workers. She made her preliminary notes and zoomed in to verify image quality. That's when she saw it. The youngest sister's forearms, partially visible below the 3/4 sleeves of her dress, showed muscle definition that shouldn't have existed. Not on a teenage girl, not in 1898, not living in the grinding poverty of the post-slavery South, where chronic malnutrition was the norm. The striations were visible even in the grainy photograph, the density unmistakable. Her shoulders were broader than her sister's, her neck thicker, her entire upper body suggesting physical development that defied the context. Dr. Hayes had spent 15 years studying historical health conditions, examining thousands of photographs from this era. She knew what malnourished bodies looked like, what manual labor produced, what poverty carved into flesh and bone. This was different. This was exceptional in a way that made her hands tremble as she adjusted the zoom. She'd seen this kind of musculature before, but only in modern medical journals. Only in case studies of a genetic condition so rare that fewer than 100 cases had been documented worldwide. A condition that science hadn't even identified until 1997, 99 years after this photograph was taken. Dr. Hayes sat back from her computer, her mind racing through the impossibility of what she was seeing. She needed confirmation. She needed someone to tell her she wasn't imagining this. She picked up her phone and called Dr. Marcus Freeman, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins who specialized in muscle development disorders. When he answered, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight with suppressed excitement, "I need you to look at something. And I need you to tell me if I'm losing my mind." 2 days later, Dr. Marcus Freeman stood in Dr. Hayes' office at Vanderbilt, staring at the photograph displayed on her large monitor. He'd flown in from Baltimore that morning, skeptical, but intrigued. Patricia Hayes didn't make frivolous claims. If she thought she'd found something impossible, it deserved investigation. The image filled the screen. Three Sisters, Alabama, 1898. Patricia zoomed in on the youngest sister, isolating her upper body, her arms, her shoulders. The evidence was there, undeniable even in the limitations of 19th century photography. Marcus leaned closer, adjusting his glasses, his trained eye cataloging what he was seeing. Myostatin-related muscle hypertrophy, a genetic condition caused by mutations in the MSTN gene that regulates muscle growth. In normal human development, myostatin acts as a brake on muscle tissue, preventing excessive growth. When that gene is mutated, the brake fails. Muscle develops with extraordinary density and volume, creating a physique that appears almost sculptural, even without exercise or training. The condition is vanishingly rare. Since its identification in 1997, fewer than 100 cases have been documented worldwide. Most are discovered in infancy, when parents notice their baby is unusually muscular. The children grow into adults with twice the muscle mass of typical individuals, exceptional strength, and remarkable resistance to physical fatigue. Marcus studied the youngest sister's deltoid muscles, visible even through her dress fabric. Her forearms showed striations that would require years of intense manual labor in anyone without the condition. But this wasn't just labor, this was genetic architecture written into her DNA, expressed in every muscle fiber. The shoulder width, Marcus said quietly, pointing to the screen. The neck thickness, the visible muscle density in the forearms. Patricia, this fits every clinical marker we use for diagnosis today. Patricia nodded, her expression tense. I know. But this is 1898, Marcus continued, voicing the impossibility they were both thinking. We didn't identify this condition for another 99 years. There's no way anyone looking at this girl would have understood what they were seeing. Which means, Patricia said slowly, she went through her entire life with no one understanding what she was. No medical explanation, no framework for comprehension. Marcus sat down heavily in the chair across from Patricia's desk. We need to find out who she was. We need to know what her life was like. The back of the photograph provided their first clue. When Patricia had initially cataloged the image, she'd photographed both sides. On the reverse, in careful script faded to brown with age, someone had written, Ruby, Esther, and Grace. Montgomery County, summer 1898. 3 names, no surname, no specific location beyond the county, but it was a starting point. Patricia began with the 1900 United States Census, the closest complete record to the photograph's date. Montgomery County, Alabama, had a black population of nearly 30,000 in 1900. Most worked as sharecroppers, domestic servants, or manual laborers. Finding 3 sisters with these specific names in that massive population would require patience and methodical searching. She spent 2 weeks combing through digital census records, cross-referencing households that listed 3 daughters in the approximate age range. The work was tedious, eye-straining, filled with dead ends and near misses. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in late March, she found them. A household headed by Caroline, age 42, occupation listed as laundress. 3 daughters, Ruby, age 20, Esther, age 19, Grace, age 18. No father listed, no other family members in the household. An address in the rural outskirts of Montgomery County, near a crossroads settlement called Pine Level. Patricia's hands trembled as she copied the information into her research notes. Grace, the youngest sister in the photograph, age 18 in 1900, which meant she would have been 16 in 1898, exactly as Patricia had estimated. But the census revealed something else, something that made Patricia's chest tighten. Caroline's occupation, laundress, one of the most brutal forms of labor available to black women in the post-Reconstruction South. Hauling water, heating it over open fires, scrubbing clothes by hand, wringing them dry with raw hands, hanging them in the brutal Alabama sun, then ironing them with heavy flat irons heated on wood stoves. It was work that destroyed women's bodies. Most laundresses didn't live past 50, their backs broken, their hands gnarled, their spirits crushed by the relentless physical demands. Patricia thought about Grace, standing in that photograph with her impossible strength. In a family surviving on a laundress's income, a daughter who could lift twice what others could lift, who could work longer without tiring, who never seemed to wear down, such a daughter would have been invaluable. Such a daughter would have been exploited. Marcus began researching the physiological implications, while Patricia dug deeper into the historical record. They needed to understand not just what Grace's condition was, but what it would have meant for her in 1898, Alabama. Montgomery County in the late 19th century was a place of rigid hierarchies and brutal realities. Black families existed under the crushing weight of Jim Crow laws, sharecropping contracts that amounted to economic slavery, and the constant threat of violence. For black women, the world was even more constrained. They worked as domestic servants, laundresses, field laborers, jobs that paid almost nothing and demanded everything. Patricia found records showing that Caroline, the girl's mother, had been born into slavery in 1858. She was 9 years old when emancipation came. After the Civil War, she had worked as a domestic servant in Montgomery before moving to the rural outskirts, where she could take in laundry from white families while raising her daughters alone. The records showed no husband, no father listed for any of the girls. The work of a laundress was devastating. Patricia found medical reports from the era documenting the physical toll: chronic back problems, arthritis in the hands and wrists, respiratory issues from breathing smoke and steam, burns from handling hot irons. Most laundresses worked alone, but some employed their daughters once the girls were old enough to haul water and wring out heavy, water-soaked cloth. Marcus explained what Grace's condition would have meant physically. Myostatin deficiency doesn't just create muscle mass, it fundamentally alters metabolism, bone density, and physical endurance. People with the condition typically have extremely low body fat, dense bones that resist fracture, and cardiovascular systems capable of sustaining intense activity for extended periods without fatigue. For Grace, living in rural Alabama in 1898, these traits would have been both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because they made her capable of work that could help her family survive. A curse because they made her visibly different in a world that punished difference. Think about what this means. Marcus said during one of their research calls. Grace could have done the work of 2 or 3 people. She could have hauled water, lifted loads, worked hours that would have exhausted anyone else, and in a family struggling to survive on a laundress's income, that ability would have been impossible to ignore. Patricia understood what he was saying. Grace's strength hadn't been a gift, it had been an obligation. Patricia's breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the diary of a plantation owner's daughter, preserved in the Montgomery County Historical Society. The diary, covering the years 1899 to 1902, contained scattered references to local black families, including several mentions of Caroline the laundress and her daughters. The first reference was brief, dated February 1900. Mother sent me to the laundress cottage to retrieve father's shirts. The youngest girl was there, Grace, I believe. She was carrying water from the well with such ease that I could scarcely believe it. 2 full buckets that would have strained our strongest field hand, yet she moved as though they weighed nothing. Patricia photographed the page with shaking hands. Physical evidence, contemporary documentation of Grace's extraordinary strength, witnessed and recorded by someone who had seen her in person. But it was another entry, dated July 1901, that made Patricia's throat tighten. Grace delivered the washing today, carrying a basket so heavy that Thomas, our manservant, struggled to lift it from the wagon. Yet she had carried it herself from the cottage, nearly a mile distant. I asked how she managed such weight. She only smiled and said she had always been strong. Mother remarked later that there is something unnatural about the girl's strength. I confess I find it unsettling. The word unnatural stood out on the yellowed page. In 1901, in rural Alabama, a black girl with extraordinary physical strength would have been viewed with suspicion, perhaps fear. There was no framework for understanding what Grace was, no medical explanation that would make sense to the people around her. Patricia found more references in local records. A ledger from a Montgomery County cotton gin showed that, in 1902, a worker named Grace had been employed during harvest season. Next to her name, someone had written, "Exceptional output, equivalent to 2 field hands, retained for extended season." Marcus reviewed the evidence with growing concern. "They were using her," he said flatly. "They saw what she could do, and they extracted every ounce of work they could get." Patricia nodded. The pattern was clear. Grace's strength had been noticed, remarked upon, exploited, but never understood, never accommodated, never valued as anything more than a capacity for labor that could be wrung dry. The more evidence Patricia and Marcus uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Grace's strength had made her useful, but it had also isolated her. In a world where black women were already marginalized, being physically different added another layer of alienation. Patricia found a hospital admission record from 1904 at a charity clinic in Montgomery. The handwriting was barely legible, the paper water-stained, but the content was unmistakable. Patient, Grace, age 22, laundress, admitted for treatment of severe lacerations to both hands sustained while operating laundry equipment. Patient reports working extended hours to support family. Physical examination reveals extraordinary muscle development in arms, shoulders, and back. Musculature appears almost masculine in density and definition. No signs of disease. Etiology unknown. Marcus examined a photograph of the admission record. The doctor had no framework for understanding what he was seeing, he said. He notes the musculature as unusual, but can't explain it. This was 1904. Genetics barely existed as a science. The concept of genetic mutations affecting muscle development wouldn't be articulated for another 90 years. But what struck Patricia was the injury itself. Grace's hands had been severely lacerated while operating laundry equipment. Not because she was careless, but likely because she was applying force beyond what the equipment was designed to handle. Her strength had damaged the machinery, and the machinery had damaged her in return. Patricia found more evidence in county records. In 1906, Grace was listed as a worker at a lumber mill outside Montgomery. The notation in the employment ledger read, Grace, exceptional strength, capable of handling logs that require 2 men, paid standard wage. Capable of doing the work of 2 men, Marcus observed, but paid the wage of 1 woman. And in 1906, Alabama, that woman's wage would have been a fraction of what a man earned. Patricia discovered that Grace had married in 1908. The marriage certificate listed her husband as Samuel, a sharecropper. But the 1910 census showed something that made Patricia pause. The household listed Grace and Samuel, but no children. The notation under children born was 0. The notation under children living was also 0. Marcus noted the significance immediately. Myostatin deficiency can sometimes affect fertility. Not always, but in some documented cases, yes. If Grace was unable to have children, that would have been yet another way she was different, another way she didn't fit the expected role for a woman in that time and place. After 1910, the documentary trail went cold. Patricia searched through census records, death certificates, property records, church registries. Nothing. Grace seemed to have disappeared from the historical record entirely. This wasn't uncommon for black women in rural Alabama, especially those who didn't own property, didn't have children, and didn't leave behind anything considered worth preserving. But for Patricia, the absence felt personal. She'd spent 6 months following Grace's life through fragmentary evidence. The thought of losing her to historical oblivion was unbearable. She expanded her search, posting inquiries on genealogical forms, and reaching out to local historical societies across Alabama. She contacted descendants of families who had lived in Montgomery County during that era, asking if anyone remembered stories about a woman named Grace who possessed extraordinary strength. For weeks, nothing. Then, in late September 2023, Patricia received an email from a woman named Lorraine Mitchell, a retired schoolteacher in Birmingham. The subject line read, "I think my grandmother knew Grace." Patricia's hands shook as she opened the message. Lorraine explained that her grandmother, Beatrice, had grown up in Pine Level in the early 1900s. Beatrice had died in 1989 at age 94, but she had often told stories about her childhood, including memories of a woman who lived near her family. "My grandmother used to talk about a woman named Grace who could do things no one else could do," Lorraine wrote. She said Grace could lift a wagon wheel by herself, that she worked in the fields alongside men and never showed signs of tiring. But grandmother also said Grace was lonely. People were afraid of her strength or jealous of it, or both. Grandmother said Grace was kind but kept to herself. She died young, grandmother thought, maybe in her early 40s. Just worn out, despite all that strength. Patricia read the email 3 times, her vision blurring with tears. Worn out, despite all that strength. It was the perfect, heartbreaking summary of Grace's life. She contacted Lorraine immediately, and over the following weeks, they worked together to piece together what Beatrice had remembered. Grace had continued working through the 1910s and 1920s, always in physical labor, always pushing her body beyond what seemed humanly possible. She had remained married to Samuel until his death in 1928. After that, the memories became vague. As Patricia and Marcus pieced together Grace's story, another pattern emerged, one that reframed her entire life. Grace's strength hadn't just sustained her, it had saved her entire family. Patricia traced the lives of Grace's mother and sisters through census records, city directories, and church registries. Caroline, the mother, lived to age 68, extraordinarily old for a laundress in that era. Most women in her profession died by 50, their bodies broken by relentless physical labor. But Caroline had survived, and the records suggested why. By 1905, Caroline was no longer listed as a laundress. Her occupation had changed to keeping house, which typically meant she was retired or semi-retired. Patricia found property records showing that Caroline owned the small house where she lived, unusual for a black woman in rural Alabama at that time. Someone had helped her buy that house. Someone had provided the financial stability that allowed her to stop destroying her body with laundry work. Grace's sisters had both married by 1905. Ruby married a carpenter and had 5 children. Esther married a teacher and had 4 children. Both families appeared regularly in census records through the 1920s and beyond, establishing households, raising children, creating futures. Patricia showed Marcus the pattern. "Look at the timeline," she said. Caroline stops working as a laundress in 1905. The sisters marry around the same time. Both establish stable households. And Grace? Grace is listed as a mill worker in 1906, a field laborer in 1908, a lumber worker in 1912. She never stops. Marcus understood immediately. Grace was supporting all of them. Her wages, her labor. She was the foundation that allowed her mother to retire and her sisters to marry men who weren't wealthy. Patricia found more evidence. Tax records from Montgomery County showed small but regular payments on Caroline's property through 1920. The payments came from an account listed under Grace's name. She had been paying her mother's taxes, keeping the house that gave Caroline security in her old age. "She carried them," Patricia said quietly, looking at the photograph again. 3 sisters standing together in 1898. Ruby and Esther standing tall because Grace, the youngest, had carried them through. Her whole life, she carried them. And they survived because of her. Dr. Hayes and Dr. Freeman published their findings in the Journal of Medical Genetics in late 2023. The paper, titled Historical Evidence of Myostatin-Related Muscle Hypertrophy in a Photograph from 1898, presented the photograph, the historical research, and the medical analysis that supported their conclusion. The paper made international headlines. Medical researchers were fascinated by the possibility of identifying genetic conditions in historical photographs. Historians were intrigued by the window into the lives of black women in the post-Reconstruction South. Geneticists wanted to know if there were living descendants who might carry the same mutation. But for Patricia, the significance went deeper than academic recognition. Grace's photograph had been sitting in an archive for 125 years, overlooked and unremarkable. Now, people around the world were seeing her, truly seeing her, and understanding that her life had been extraordinary. Grace had lived in a time and place that gave her no recognition, no accommodation, no understanding of what her body was capable of or what it needed. She had been strong in a world that punished strength in black women, that exploited their labor and gave nothing in return. She had carried burdens that would have broken others, and she had done it in silence because that was what survival required. Marcus noted something else in their follow-up research. Historical records showed that Grace had helped her family survive. Her mother, Caroline, lived to age 68, exceptionally old for a laundress in that era. Her sisters both married and had children, establishing families that continued for generations. Grace's strength had bought them time, security, and survival. She was the reason they made it, Marcus said simply. Without her, that family doesn't survive the turn of the century. She was their foundation. Patricia thought about that photograph again. 3 sisters standing in front of a white house in Alabama, 1898. Ruby and Esther, standing tall because Grace had carried them through. The revelation transformed how Patricia understood the photograph. It wasn't just 3 sisters posing for a portrait. It was a record of sacrifice, of extraordinary strength used not for personal gain but for family survival. It was a testament to a young woman who carried the weight of an entire family on shoulders that were genetically designed to bear impossible loads. And it was proof that sometimes the most extraordinary stories hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see them. The photograph of Ruby, Esther, and Grace now resides in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, displayed as part of an exhibition on black family life in the post-Reconstruction South. But its label tells a different story than most archival photographs. It explains myostatin deficiency, describes Grace's likely experience, and honors her as one of the earliest documented cases of a genetic condition that science wouldn't identify for another century. Lorraine, the schoolteacher whose grandmother had known Grace, visited the exhibition in early 2024. She stood in front of the photograph for nearly an hour, studying the face of the youngest sister. Later, she told Patricia that seeing Grace honored in this way felt like closing a circle. My grandmother said Grace never complained, never talked about how hard her life was. Lorraine said, she just worked and helped and kept going. I'm glad people finally understand what that meant. I'm glad she's not invisible anymore. Patricia returned to that photograph often in the months after publication. Each time she noticed something new. The way Grace's hand rested protectively near her sister's shoulder, the slight tilt of her head that suggested both strength and gentleness, the eyes that looked directly at the camera with an expression that could be read as defiance or simply presence. Grace had lived 30-something years in a world that had no language for what she was, no framework for understanding her body, no way to honor her strength except to exploit it. She had survived by working harder than anyone thought possible, and she had paid the price with her health, her relationships, and ultimately her life. But she had also left something behind. Not children, not property, not written words, but a photograph. One image, captured in a moment of stillness in the summer of 1898, that would eventually tell the world who she was. Dr. Hayes often thinks about the odds. What were the chances that this one photograph would survive? That it would end up in an archive Patricia happened to be digitizing? That Patricia would zoom in at just the right moment and see what no one else had seen? Maybe it wasn't chance, Marcus suggested once. Maybe Grace wanted to be seen. Maybe that's why they paid for that photograph, even though it cost money they didn't have, because on some level, they knew this moment mattered. Patricia doesn't know if she believes that, but she knows this. Grace stood in front of that camera in 1898 in rural Alabama, in the heart of Jim Crow America, and she let herself be captured exactly as she was, strong, different, unbreakable. And 125 years later, the world finally looked closely enough to see her.